On this morning's Ag Issues program, as always, a pleasure to bring on to the program Roger McEowen, professor of agricultural law and taxation at the Washburn University School of Law, as he joins us on the program. By the way, great follow on Twitter as well, at Washburn, W-A-L-T-R, at Washburn, W-A-L-T-R is his Twitter handle. And Roger joins us on the program this morning. Roger, good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Greg. Just fine, thanks.
Well, let's get right to it. We got a couple of big things to talk about. And, you know, one of the problems that we look at is on the farm and ranch estates, but it's a possibility of a reduction in the federal state tax exemption, pretty significant in agriculture. In this case, what we're looking at is the illiquidity in an ag estate.
Yeah, and that two problems there. You mentioned the possible reduction in the federal estate tax exemption, although Chuck Grassley, you may have noted late last week, said if that bill gets to the Senate, it's dead on arrival. And there really is, as I travel the country, Greg, and talk to practitioners as well as farmers, there is an interesting difference in the view of practitioners and the view of farmers. Most attorneys and CPAs, the vast majority, I'd say 90 to 95%, think that there will not be a reduction in the exemption, and the vast majority of producers think there will be. I think that is really an interesting take, and I'm not quite sure what's driving that, but just based on experience, the exemption's never gone down. And so from the practitioner standpoint, that's what we look at and say, look, they've never reduced it in the past. They're just blowing smoke on this. It's not going to go down. But if you're on the other end of this, where you're dealing with your farm estate, your ranch estate, you are worried about this. And so I understand why there is that difference, but it's really unique as I talk to different groups and the feelings of people. But it all points out that you've got to be as planned as well as you possibly can. And that's the crazy thing right now because of all of this uncertainty. It's difficult to know what to do, what you can do if the rules change. And so you just try and be as flexible as possible. The second problem as a result of that is a classic problem of farm and ranch estates, no matter what the size of the exemption, and that is that a farm or ranch estate tends to be very illiquid. You've probably heard the saying that ag estates are often asset-rich but cash-poor, and that's true for many, many operations. Well, that's the other concern that's out there because if the Congress drops the federal estate tax exemption significantly, and the talk is it would go to $3.5 million, but even if it goes to $5 million, we're looking at 11.7 right now per person, and probably 12.4 million next year. That is a humongous reduction. And so if you have a very illiquid estate, I did a blog article in May that just projected a current taxable estate of $12 million would have no federal estate tax, but if you drop the exemption to $3.5 million, then your federal estate tax bill is about $2.4 million. Okay, there's the rub. Where are you going to come up with the money to pay $2.4 million in federal estate taxes that all becomes due 9 months after date of death? So what are your options? And that's what I recently wrote about, this illiquidity problem. What can you do during life to give yourself some liquidity at death to pay costs associated with death, which one of those might be a federal estate tax?
And then could possibly one of those be looking at life insurance?
Yeah, certainly. Life insurance plays a big role. That's a good technique for farmers and ranchers. The problem is that often farm and ranch estates do not have comparable levels of life insurance to the non-farm compatriots in town that have a salaried job. They tend to have a lot of life insurance. In fact, I just read a story this morning, and you know, this sad saga of somebody that died, a 37-year-old person that died in Missouri, not a farmer or rancher, but it ran in the Washington Post, died from the virus, leaving wife and small kids, and now they have to sell their home. Well, they didn't have any life insurance, didn't have any disability insurance. Health insurance was questionable. That's a lack of planning. Tomorrow's not guaranteed. Today's not guaranteed. The next minute's not guaranteed. Life insurance is a good way to have funds for a surviving spouse, for your family, as well in the ag context. If you have a family business that you're intending to pass on to the next generation, it's a good way to fund a buyout of off-farm heirs, so that if you have the situation where you have both on-farm and off-farm heirs, the on-farm heirs want to have the ability to run the operation without interference from their off-farm siblings. So one of the ways that we can do that is with a buy-sell agreement, a mandatory buy-sell, that one of the triggering events is death, and we fund it with life insurance so that those proceeds can be used to buy out the off-farm heirs so that they get cash and then the on-farm heirs get control. So life insurance plays a really critical role for farmers and ranchers, and more of them should be looking at it than they are. There are other ways to use life insurance, but that is a very good tool that's out there. And clearly, Greg, one of the industries that would, frankly, not be displeased by a drop in the federal estate tax exemption would be the life insurance industry, just simply because they'll sell more policies. And, that's just the way it works. It is a good tool to provide some liquidity at death.
Now, of course, many farms out there operate in some sort of partnership or a corporate type of form, and that's where a buy-sell agreement would come into play here?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was talking about just a moment ago. That's where that buy-sell comes into play. If you have a well-drafted agreement and well-defined triggering events that's properly funded, and I would fund that with life insurance, then you can ensure that there will be a buyer for the decedent's ownership interest on death. That's one of the problems that we have in small, closely held, non-publicly traded interests in a farming or ranching operation. There's no market for it. Well, if we have a buy-sell that's a mandatory buy-sell, we create a market for the decedent's interest in that family operation, and then if we fund it by life insurance, there's means by which the buyout can be exercised. And then if we have a multi-generation operation with on-farm and off-farm heirs, that's how we separate out the interest, the control from the financial side of things between those heirs. So it is a really good instrument. I'd say a good buy-sell is just about as important to a farming or ranching operation as a good will or a trust.
Bottom line in all this, Roger, your plan, whatever that plan is, periodically you probably should take a look at it and to review it as well.
Yeah, I think people right now, farmers and ranchers, need to sit down and make a current estimate of their existing monetary obligations that their estate is expected to face upon death, do multiple projections based on what you think the federal estate tax exemption is going to be, have somebody project what the taxes might be based on those estimates, and then plan accordingly. Do you need life insurance? What about your investment strategy? What are you doing in the good years when you have excess income? Most farmers just dump it right back into the operation, buy more machinery, fix things around the farm or the ranch, but take a look at your overall portfolio in terms of what you're doing. And use the existing tax code provisions to help provide liquidity at death, maybe a special use valuation election in the decedent's estate to value that farmland at its ag value rather than fair market value, or elect to pay any resulting federal estate tax in installments over 15 years rather than having the entire bill due and payable 9 months after death. So there are some tools out there. There are some things that people need to be thinking about right now, particularly if that exemption is going to go down. These tools have to be utilized for many people.
Roger McEowen, Professor of Agricultural Law and Taxation at the Washburn University School of Law, is joining us. And Roger, this topic we're going to discuss is one that I'm sure hits home with many of our listeners out there, that people who have had or will have a family member in need of in-home or nursing home care. And there's also a lot to talk about. And unfortunately, what it leads to sometime is elder abuse. And you've got quite the case that takes a look at this. And your point of the blog that you had was planning to avoid elder abuse.
Yeah, that's right. And what precipitated it was reading of a U.S. tax court decision. Now, it's not often that you end up writing about elder abuse from reading tax court cases. But this was an egregious case. Obviously, it was a tax issue that was involved, but the facts behind it were just atrocious with respect to elder abuse. What you had was an individual who was born on a Montana family farming operation in the eastern Montana wheat country in 1915. He eventually moved to California and practiced optometry, never married, lived very frugally in a second-story apartment. And he invested his money prudently, and he grew that sum to a little bit over $3 million. Well, in 2000, when he was 85, this doctor fell and broke his hip. He rehabilitated, but by the time he reached 91, he couldn't drive. He couldn't prepare his own food. He couldn't go to the doctor by himself. He couldn't do anything. He needed help 24 hours around the clock. And he had hearing problems, vision loss, also had a stroke. He had dementia, cognitive decline, short-term memory was diminished. He had trouble recalling details about his assets, about his finances. And he had incontinence, atrial fibrillation, congestive heart failure, hypertension, chronic back pain, arthritis. The list goes on and on. I mean, he's got all types of trouble. And you can imagine a person in that condition and that age with all of those problems needs somebody helping him and assisting him all the time. He can't take care of himself. Well, he outlives all of his siblings. Remember, he never married, never had any kids. He has no other family members, and at age 91, he's hospitalized again for numerous conditions. And his doctor says, well, you can't go back to your apartment unless you have some in-home care. And there was a hospital employee that had heard this and learned about this, and she slipped a note to him. Even though the hospital policy says you can't solicit patients for other work, she slips a note to him offering her services for in-home care. He accepts the offer, pays her $6,000 a month, which is more than 50% of the going rate at that time, plus an additional amount for groceries. And then she uses the money that she's getting from him to put a down payment on $1 million home and starts to pressure him to make mortgage payments. And ultimately, he writes her checks totaling over $400,000, and that grew to about $1.5 million. And then what happened? And here's the interesting thing: what tipped the boat, so to speak, and started her slide downhill was he wrote in a very short period of time 5 $100,000 checks to her, this in-home care aide. But because most of his money was in investments, the Vanguard Group mutual funds, the Vanguard representative called him and questioned why 5 checks were written in a very short time frame. And Vanguard records their calls. A lot of these companies do. They record their calls, and they could hear her in the background, or they could hear a woman's voice in the background coaching him as to what to say. That tripped their fraud alerts. They ultimately, what happens, Vanguard calls the California Department of Health and Human Services. An investigator goes out and checks on what has happened. They find the apartment is in complete disarray, just awful surroundings. He wasn't even given good care, hardly any care at all, let alone being stolen from and taken advantage of. Well, what got the IRS involved was that she wasn't reporting the payments that she received from this doctor she was taking care of. And she just said, well, these are gifts or loans. And the tax court, agreeing with the IRS, said, no, that's not. That's trade or business income, and you have to pay self-employment tax on it. So based on that, then I go through a list of how can you prevent that stuff from happening? And that's really the crux of what the discussion is in that blog article.
It's amazing and a very sad story to talk about as well. And it just, it's simple things, but things that are very important on trying to avoid this situation.
Yeah. Keep your eyes and your ears open. Be alert for situations where a vulnerable person can be taken advantage of. And then stay on top of the cognitive ability of a family member, having them regularly professionally tested. And then before in-home care starts, before nursing home care starts, sit down with them and list out all their assets. Make sure you know the nature and extent of their assets, because if you don't know what they have, you don't know what's missing. And it's easy for little stuff to be taken and not be missed if you don't know they had it in the first place. So that's a key one. And then maybe change the mail to a family member. or a post office box, so that you've got control over the mail. You can see what's been paid, what are the bills, get control of various accounts, monitor receipts. If you have an aide that's buying groceries or supplies, require that receipts be retained, and then commit to checking them at least periodically, and check in on the person unannounced periodically, because that lets a would-be thief know that the individual's being checked on. And then make sure valuables are kept in a safety deposit box or a safe that an aide cannot access. And make sure you've got legal documents that are in place, a power of attorney for financial and healthcare decisions, a will or a trust. And those are just, I think, some, like I said, some common sense things, but they're often overlooked. None of that was done in Dr. Marsh's case, in this tax court case, and it resulted in just a horrible scenario.
All right. Hey, one other thing that we wanted to talk about real quick, and we're going to talk more about this in future episodes, and this was a Thursday court decision that affects Kansas's, if you term it ag-gag law, that it was termed unconstitutional by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit.
Yeah, I've written a lot on this issue over the years, and actually have tried to help some legislatures across the country that are interested in this write these laws to try to make sure they get through the courts with success. This is tough to swallow, and I agree with the dissent in this case. In fact, the dissent reads like one of my blog posts, and that is you can't lie to obtain consent to enter the premises of an ag facility. That's not protected speech in my view. But this was a 2-1 opinion and went the other way. And it's tough to deal with people whose intent is to damage your business. Now, the question is, how do you prevent that from happening in a constitutional way? That is the line that the law is struggling to figure out where that's at, and legislatures are trying to figure out where that's at. And that's really the crux of the problem. But I'll be writing more on this in the future.
All right, sounds good. Hey, Roger, we're out of time, but as always, great discussion, and appreciate you joining us on the program this morning.
Thank you, Greg.
That is Roger McEowen, professor of agricultural law and taxation at the Washburn University School of Law, who joins us on the Ag Issues program here on 580 WIBW.